Hi readers, have you found yourselves wondering and thinking about the BFG? Good readers are often thinking about what's going to happen next in the story. We've talked about setting the purpose for the story or asking questions, because when you ask questions, you're more focused on gathering all your information in the story. So we know that when we last left, Sophie was sitting on the windowsill in the Queen's room. So vocabulary for today is motionless. And I undered the LESS because that is a suffix that means without. So without motion, so not moving or stationary. Petrified, which means you're so frightened that you're unable to move. Beseechingly is to ask someone urgently to do something. Absurd is wildly inappropriate. And frantic is distraught with fear or other emotion. So if you think about the dream, maybe the Queen is feeling a lot of these words that I just showed you. So let's get to it. The Queen. Dawn came at last. So now if you think about it, Sophie was taken the night before. So she's gone a whole day now and she's back to the next morning. So this story, when you think about the setting, we're at about 24 hours. It hasn't gone on for days and days. A lot happened in one day with Sophie. Dawn came at last, and the rim of the lemon-colored sun rose up behind the rooftop, somewhere behind Victoria Station. A while later, Sophie felt a little of its warmth on her back and was grateful. In the distance, she heard a church clock striking. She counted the strikes. There were 7. She found it almost impossible to believe that she, Sophie, a little orphan of no real importance in the world, was at this moment actually sitting high above the ground on the windowsill of the Queen of England's bedroom, with the Queen herself asleep in there behind the curtain, not more than 5 yards away. The very idea of it was absurd. No one had ever done such a thing before. It was a terrifying thing to be doing. What would happen if the dream didn't work? No one, least of all the Queen, would believe a word of her story. It seemed possible that nobody had ever woken up to find a small child sitting behind the curtain of his or her windowsill. The Queen was bound to get a shock. Who wouldn't? With all the patience of a small girl who has something important to wait for, Sophie sat motionless on the windowsill. How much longer, she wondered. What time do queens wake up? Faint stirrings and distant sounds came to her from deep inside the belly of the palace. Then all at once, beyond the curtains, she heard the voice of a sleeper in the bedroom. It was a slightly blurred sleep talker's voice. "Oh no," it cried. "No, don't. Someone stop them. Don't let them do it. I can't bear it. Oh, please stop them. It's horrible. Oh, it's ghastly. Please stop. Oh, no, no, no." She was having the dream, Sophie told herself. It must be really hard. I feel so sorry for her, but it has to be done. After that, there were a few moans. Then there was a long silence. Sophie waited. She looked over her shoulder. She was terrified that she would see the man with the dog down in the garden staring up at her. But the garden was deserted. No one's there. A pale summer mist hung over it like smoke. It was an enormous garden, very beautiful, with a large funny-shaped lake at the far end. There was an island in the lake, and there were ducks swimming on the water. Inside the room, beyond the curtains, Sophie suddenly heard what was obviously a knock on the door. She heard the doorknob turn. She heard someone entering the room. "Good morning, Your Majesty," a woman was saying. It was the voice of an oldish person. There was a pause and then a slight rattle of china and silver. "Will you have your tray on the bed, ma'am, or on the table?" "Oh, Mary, something awful has just happened." This was a voice Sophie had heard many times on radio and television, especially on Christmas Day. It was a very well-known voice. "Whatever is it, ma'am?" "I've just had the most frightful dream. It was a nightmare. It was awful." "Oh, I'm so sorry, ma'am, but don't be distressed. You're awake now and it will go away. It was only a dream, ma'am." "Do you know what I dreamt, Mary? I dreamt that girls and boys were being snatched out of their beds at boarding schools and were being eaten by the most ghastly giants. The giants were putting their arms in through the dormitory windows and plucking the children out with their fingers. One lot from a girls' school and another from a boys' school. It was all so vivid, Mary. It was so real." There was silence. Sophie waited. She was quivering with excitement. But why the silence? Why didn't the other one, the maid, why didn't she say something? What on earth's the matter, Mary? The famous voice was saying. There was another silence. Mary, you've gone as white as a sheet. Are you feeling ill? There was suddenly a crash of a clatter of crockery, which could have only meant that the tray the maid was carrying had fallen out of her hands. Mary, the famous voice was saying rather sharply, I think you'd better sit down at once. You look as though you're going to faint. You really mustn't take it so hard just because I was having an awful dream. That isn't the reason, ma'am. The maid's voice was quivering terribly. Then for heaven's sake, what is the reason? Very sorry about the tray, ma'am. Oh, don't worry about the tray, but what on earth was it that made you drop it? Why did you go white as a ghost all of the sudden? You haven't seen the papers yet, have you, ma'am? No? What do they say? Sophie heard the rustling of a newspaper as it was being handed over. It's like the very dream you had in the night, ma'am. Rubbish, Mary. Where is it? On the front page, ma'am. It's the big headline. Great Scott, cried the famous voice. 18 girls vanished mysteriously from their beds at Rodean School. 14 boys disappear from Eton. Bones are found underneath dormitory windows. Then there was a pause, punctuated by gasps from the famous voice as the newspaper article was clearly being read and digested. That means she's thinking about it. Oh, how ghastly, the famous voice cried out. It's absolutely frightful. Bones under the windows? What can have happened? Oh, those poor children. But, ma'am, don't you see, ma'am? See what, Mary? Those children were taken almost exactly as you dreamt it, ma'am. Not by giants, Mary. No, ma'am, but the bit about the girls and boys disappearing from their dormitories. You dreamt it so clearly, and then it actually happened. That is why it came over me so oddly, ma'am. I'm feeling a bit odd myself. It gives me the shakes, ma'am, when something like that happens. It really does. I don't blame you, Mary. I shall get you some more breakfast, ma'am, and have this mess cleaned up. No, don't go, Mary. Stay here a moment. Sophie wished she could see into the room, but she didn't dare touch the curtains. The famous voice began speaking again. I really did dream about those children, Mary. It was as clear as crystal. I know you did, ma'am. I don't know how giants got into it. That was rubbish. Shall I draw the curtains, ma'am? Then we will all feel better. It's a lovely day. Uh-oh. Please do. With a swish, the great curtains were pulled aside. The maid screamed. Sophie froze on the window ledge. The queen, sitting up in her bed with the Times on her lap, glanced up sharply. Now it was her turn to freeze. She didn't scream as the maid had done. Queens are too self-controlled for that. She simply sat there staring wide-eyed and white-faced at the small girl who was perched on her windowsill in her nightie. Sophie was petrified. Curiously enough, the queen looked petrified too. One of it would have expected her to look surprised, as you or I would have done had we discovered a small girl sitting on our windowsill first thing in the morning. But the queen didn't look surprised. She looked genuinely frightened. The maid, a middle-aged woman with a funny cap on the top of her head, was the first to recover. What in the name of heaven do you think you're doing in here? She shouted angrily at Sophie. Sophie looked beseechingly towards the queen for help. The queen was still staring at Sophie. Gaping at her would be more accurate. Her mouth was slightly open, her eyes were round as two wide saucers, and the whole of that famous, rather lovely face was filled with disbelief. Now listen here, young lady. How on earth did you get into this room? The maid shouted furiously. I don't believe it, the queen was murmuring. I simply don't believe it. I'll take her out, ma'am, at once, the maid was saying. No, Mary, no. Don't do that. The queen spoke so sharply that the maid was quite taken aback. She turned and stared at the queen. What on earth had come over her? It looked as though she was in a state of shock. Are you all right, ma'am? The maid was saying. When the queen spoke again, it was in a strange, strangled sort of whisper. Tell me, Mary, she said. Tell me quite truthfully, is there really a little girl sitting on my windowsill, or am I still dreaming? She's sitting there all right, ma'am, as clear as daylight. But heaven only knows how she got there. Your Majesty is certainly not dreaming at this time. But that's exactly what I did dream, the queen cried out. I dreamt that as well. I dreamt there would be a little girl sitting on my windowsill, still in her nightie, and she would talk to me. The maid, with her hands clasped across her starched white shirt, was staring at her mistress with a look of absolute disbelief on her face. The situation was getting beyond her. She was lost. She had not been trained to cope with this kind of madness. Are you real? The queen said to Sophie. Yes, your majesty, Sophie murmured. What is your name? Sophie, your majesty. And how did you get on my windowsill? No, don't answer that. Hang on a moment. I dreamt that part of it too. I dreamt that a giant put you there. He did, your majesty, Sophie said. The maid gave a howl of anguish and clasped her hands over her face. Control yourself, Mary, the queen said sharply. Then to Sophie she said, You are not serious about the giants, are you? Oh, yes, your majesty. He's out there in the garden now. Is he indeed, the queen said. The sheer absurdity of it all was helping her to regain her composure. So he's in the garden, is he? She said, smiling a little. He's a good giant, your majesty, Sophie said. You need not be frightened of him. I'm delighted to hear it, the queen, said the queen, still smiling. He's my best friend, your majesty. How nice, the queen said. He's a lovely giant, your majesty. I'm quite sure he is, the queen said, but why have you and this giant come to see me? I think you have dreamt that part of it too, your majesty, Sophie said calmly. That pulled the queen up short. It took the smile right off of her face. She certainly had dreamt that part of it. She was remembering now how at the end of her dream, it had said a little girl and her big friendly giant would come and show her how to find the 9 horrible man-eating giants. But be careful, the queen told herself. Keep very calm, because this is surely not very far from the place where madness begins. You did dream that, didn't you, your majesty? Sophie said. The maid was out of it now. She just stood there in awe. Yes, the queen murmured. Yes, now you come to mention it, I did. But how do you know what I dreamed? Oh, that's a long story, your majesty, Sophie said. Would you like me to call the big friendly giant? The queen looked at the child. The child looked straight back at the queen, her face open and quite serious. The queen simply didn't know what to make of it. Was someone pulling her leg, she wondered. Shall I call him for you, Sophie went on. You'll like him very much. The queen took a deep breath. She was glad no one except her faithful old Mary was here to see what was going on. Very well, she said. You may call your giant. No, wait a minute, Mary. Pull yourself together and give me my dressing gown and slippers. The maid did as she was told. The queen got out of bed and put on a pale pink dressing gown and slippers. You may call him now, the queen said. Sophie turned her head towards the garden and called out, BFG, Her Majesty, the Queen, would like to see you. The queen crossed over the window and stood beside Sophie. Come down off of that ledge, she said. You're going to fall backwards any moment. Sophie jumped down into the room and stood beside the queen at the open window. Mary, the maid, stood behind them. Her hands were now planted firmly on her hips, and there was a look on her face which seemed to say, I don't want any part of this fiasco. I don't see any giant, the queen said. Please wait, Sophie said. Shall I take her away now, ma'am, the maid said. Take her downstairs and give her some breakfast, the queen said. Just then there was a rustle in the bushes beside the lake. Then out he came, 24 feet tall, wearing his black cloak with the grace of a nobleman, still carrying his long trumpet in one hand. He strode magnificently across the palace lawn towards the window. The maid screamed. The queen gasped. Sophie waved. The BFG took his time. He was very dignified in his approach. When he was close to the window where the 3 of them were standing, he stopped and made a slow, graceful bow. His head, after he had straightened it up again, was almost exactly level with the watchers at the window. Your Majesty, he said, I is your humbug servant. He bowed again. Considering she was meeting a giant for the first time in her life, the queen remained astonishingly self-composed. We're very pleased to meet you, she said. Down below, a gardener was coming across the lawn with a wheelbarrow. He caught sight of the BFG's legs over his left. His gaze traveled slowly upwards along the entire height of the enormous body. He gripped the handles of the wheelbarrow. He swayed, he tottered, and he keeled over on the grass in a dead faint. Nobody noticed him. "Oh, Magister," cried the BFG. "Oh, Queen, oh, Monarcher, oh, Golden Sovereign, oh, Ruler of straight lines. Oh, Sultana, I has come here with my little friend Sophie to give you—" The BFG hesitated, searching for the word. "To give me what?" the Queen said. "Assistance," the BFG said, beaming. The Queen looked puzzled. "He sometimes speaks a bit funny, Your Majesty," Sophie said. "He never went to school." "Then we must send him to school," the Queen said. "We have some very good schools in our country." "I has great secrets to tell, Your Majesty," the BFG said. "I should be delighted to hear them," the Queen said, "but not in my dressing gown." "Shall you wish to get dressed, ma'am?" the maid said. "Have either of you had breakfast?" the Queen said. "Oh, could we?" Sophie cried. "Oh, please, I haven't eaten anything since yesterday." "I was about to have mine," the Queen said, but Mary dropped it. The maid gulped. "I imagine we have more food in the palace," the Queen said, speaking to the BFG. "Perhaps you and your little friend would care to join me." "Will it be repulsant schnozkumbers, Magister?" the BFG said. "Will it be what?" the Queen said. "Stinky schnozkumbers," the BFG said. "What is he talking about?" the Queen said. "It sounds like a rude word to me." She turned to the maid and said, "Mary, ask them to serve breakfast for 3 in the— I think it better be in the ballroom. That has the highest ceiling." To the BFG, she said, "I'm afraid you will have to go through the door on your hands and knees. I shall send someone to show you the way." The BFG reached up and lifted Sophie out of the window. "You and I is leaving, Her Magister alone, to get dressed," he said. "No, leave the little girl here with me," the Queen said. "We'll have to find something for her to put on. She can't have breakfast in her nightie." The BFG returned Sophie to the bedroom. "Can we have sausages, Your Majesty?" Sophie asked. "And bacon and fried eggs?" "I think that might be managed," the Queen answered, smiling. "Just you wait till you taste it," Sophie said to the BFG. "No more schnozkumbers from now on." The royal breakfast. So how many of you enjoyed breakfast? Especially a nice breakfast with lots of maybe some fruits and some pancakes. So now think about, Sophie hasn't eaten all day and all the BFG knows is schnozkumbers. There was a frantic scurry among the palace servants when orders were received from the Queen that a 20-foot-4 giant must be seated with Her Majesty in the great ballroom within the next half hour. The butler, an imposing personage named Mr. Tibbs, was in supreme command of all the palace servants, and he did the best he could in the short time available. A man does not rise to become the Queen's butler unless he is gifted with extraordinary ingenuity, adaptability, versatility, dexterity, sophistication, and discretion, and a host of other talents that neither you nor I possess. Mr. Tibbs had them all. He was in the butler's pantry sipping an early morning glass of light ale when an order reached him. In a split second, he had made the following calculations in his head. If a normal 6-foot man requires a 3-foot-high table to eat off of, a 24-foot giant will require a 12-foot-high table. And if a 6-foot man requires a chair with 2-foot-high seat, a 24-foot giant will require a chair with 8-foot-high seat. Everything, Mr. Tibbs told himself, must be multiplied by 4. 2 breakfast eggs must become 8. 4 rashers of bacon must become 16. 3 pieces of toast must become 12, and so on. These calculations about food were immediately passed on to Monsieur Papillon, the royal chef. Mr. Tibbs skimmed into the ballroom. Butlers don't walk, they skim over the ground. Followed by a whole army of footmen. The footmen all wore knee breeches, and every one of them displayed beautifully rounded calves and ankles. There is no way you can become a royal footman unless you have a well-turned ankle. It is the first thing they look at when you're interviewed. "Push the grand piano into the center of the room," Mr. Tibbs whispered. Butlers never raised their voice above the softest whisper. The 4 footmen moved the piano. "Now fetch a large chest of drawers to put on top of the piano," Mr. Tibbs whispered. 3 other footmen fetched a very fine Chippendale mahogany chest of drawers and placed it on top of the piano. "That will be his chair," Mr. Tibbs whispered. "It is exactly 8 feet off the ground. Now we shall make a table upon which this gentleman may eat his breakfast in comfort. Fetch me 4 very tall grandfather clocks. There are plenty of them around the palace. Let each clock be 12 feet high." 16 footmen spread out around the palace to find the clocks. They were not easy to carry and required 4 footmen on each. Place the 4 clocks in a rectangle 8 feet by 4 alongside the grand piano, Mr. Tibbs whispered. The footman did so. Think about what that area would be, girls and boys. You're learning about that in math. Now fetch me the young prince's ping-pong table, Mr. Tibbs whispered. The ping-pong table was carried in. Unscrew its legs and take them away, Mr. Tibbs whispered. This was done. Now place the ping-pong table on top of the 4 grandfather clocks, Mr. Tibbs whispered. To manage this, the footman had to stand on step ladders. Mr. Tibbs stood back to survey the new furniture. None of it is in its classic style, he whispered, but it will have to do. He gave orders that a damask tablecloth should be draped over the ping-pong table, and in the end, it really looked quite elegant after all. At this point, Mr. Tibbs was seen to hesitate. The footmen all stared at him aghast. Butlers never hesitate, not even when they are faced with the most impossible problems. It is their job to be totally decisive at all times. Knives and forks and spoons, Mr. Tibbs was heard to mutter. Our cutlery will be like little pins in his hands. But Mr. Tibbs didn't hesitate for long. Tell the head gardener, he whispered, that I require immediately a brand new unused garden fork and also a spade. And for a knife we shall use the great sword hanging on the wall in the morning room. But clean the sword well first. It was last used to cut off the head of King Charles the First, and there may still be a little dried blood on the blade. When all of this had been accomplished, Mr. Tibbs stood near the center of the ballroom, casting his expert butler eye over the scene. Had he forgotten anything? He certainly had. What about a coffee cup for the large gentleman? Fetch me, he whispered, the biggest jug you can find in the kitchen. A splendid 1-gallon porcelain water jug was brought in and placed on the giant's table beside the garden fork and the garden spade and the great sword. So much for the giant. Mr. Tibbs then had the footman move a small, delicate table and 2 chairs alongside the giant's table. This was for the Queen and for Sophie. The fact that the giant's table and chair towered far above the smaller table simply could not be helped. All these arrangements were only just completed when the Queen, now fully dressed in her trim skirt and cashmere cardigan, entered the ballroom holding Sophie by the hand. A pretty blue dress that had once belonged to one of the princesses had been found for Sophie, and to make her look prettier still, the Queen had picked up a superb sapphire brooch from her dressing table and had pinned it on the left side of Sophie's chest. The big friendly giant followed behind them, but he had an awful job getting through the door. He had to squeeze himself through on his hands and knees with 2 footmen pushing him from behind and 2 pulling from the front. But he got through in the end. He had removed his black cloak and got rid of his trumpet and was now wearing his ordinary simple clothes. As he walked across the ballroom, he had to stoop quite a lot to avoid hitting the ceiling. Because of this, he failed to notice an enormous crystal chandelier. Crash! Went his head right into the chandelier. A shower of glass fell upon the poor BFG. Gunghummers and bogswinkles, he cried. What was that? It was Louis XV, the Queen said, looking slightly put out. He's never been in a house before, Sophie said. Mr. Tibbs scowled. He directed 4 footmen to clear up the mess. Then, with a disdainful little wave of the hand, he indicated to the giant that he should seat himself on top of the chest of drawers on top of the grand piano. What a fizz-whizzing, flush-bunking seat, cried the BFG. I is going to be a bug as snug in a rug up here. Does he always speak like that, the Queen asked. Quite often, Sophie said. He gets tangled up with his words. The BFG sat down on the chest of drawers, piano, and gazed in wonder around the great ballroom. By gumdrops, he cried. What a spiffling, whoopsie room we is in. It is so gigantuous, I is needing binoculars and telescopes to see what is going on at the other end. Footmen arrived carrying silver trays with fried eggs, bacon, sausages, and fried potatoes. At this point, Mr. Tibbs suddenly realized that in order to serve the BFG at his 12-foot-high grandfather clock table, he would have to climb to the top of one of the tall step ladders. What's more, he must do it balancing a huge warm plate on the palm of one hand and holding a gigantic silver coffee pot in the other. A normal man would have flinched at the thought of it, but good butlers never flinch. Up he went, up and up and up, while the Queen and Sophie watched him with great interest. It is possible they were both secretly hoping he would lose his balance and go crashing to the floor, but good butlers never crash. At the top of the ladder, Mr. Tibbs, balancing like an acrobat, poured the BFG's coffee and placed the enormous plate before him. On the plate there were 8 eggs, 12 sausages, 16 rashers of bacon, and a heap of fried potatoes. What is this, please, your Magister? The BFG asked, peering down at the Queen. He's never eaten anything except schnozkumbers. Before in his life, Sophie explained. They taste revolting. They don't seem to have stunned his growth, the Queen said. The BFG grabbed the garden spade and scooped up all the eggs, sausage, and bacon and potatoes in one go and shoveled them into his enormous mouth. By goggles, he cried, this stuff is making schnozkumbers taste like swatchwallop. The Queen glanced up, frowning. Mr. Tibbs looked down at his toes and his lips moved in silent prayer. This was only one titchy little bite, the BFG said. Is you having any more of this deluncious grubble in your cupboard, Magister? Tibbs, the Queen said, showing true regal host's hospitality, fetched the gentleman another dozen fried eggs and a dozen sausage. Mr. Tibbs swam out of the room, muttering unspeakable words to himself and wiping his brow with a white handkerchief. The BFG lifted the huge jug and took a swallow. Ugh, he cried, blowing a mouthful across the ballroom. Please, what is this horrible swig pill I is drinking, Magister? It's coffee, the Queen told him, freshly roasted. It's filthsome, the BFG cried. Where's the frobscottle? The what? The Queen asked. Delumptious fizzy frobscottle, the BFG answered. Everyone must be drinking frobscottle with breakfast, Magister. Then we can all be whiz-popping happily together afterwards. What does he mean? The Queen said, frowning at Sophie. What is whiz-popping? Sophie kept a very straight face. BFG, she said, there is no frobscottle here and whiz-popping is strictly forbidden. What? Cried the BFG. No frobscottle, no whiz-popping, no voluptuous music, no boom, boom, boom? Absolutely not, Sophie told him firmly. If he wants to sing, please don't stop him, the Queen said. He doesn't want to sing, Sophie said. He said he wants to make music, the Queen went on. Shall I send for a violin? No, Your Majesty, Sophie said. He's only joking. A sly little smile crossed the BFG's face. Listen, he said, peering down at Sophie. If they isn't having any frobscottle here in the palace, I can still go whiz-popping perfectly well without it if I is trying hard enough. No, cried Sophie, don't. You're not doing that. I beg you. Music is very good for the digestion, the Queen said. When I'm up in Scotland, they play the bagpipes outside the window while I'm eating. Do play something. I has Her Magister's permission, cried the BFG. And all at once he let fly with a whiz-popper that sounded as though a bomb had exploded in the room. The Queen jumped. Whoopee! Shouted the BFG. That is better than baglepipes, is it not, Magister? It took the Queen a few seconds to get over the shock. I prefer bagpipes, she said, but she couldn't stop herself smiling. During the next 20 minutes, the whole relay of footmen were kept busy hurrying to and from the kitchen, carrying third helpings and fourth helpings and fifth helpings of fried eggs, sausages, for the ravenous and delighted BFG. When the BFG had consumed his 72nd fried egg, Mr. Tibbs sidled up to the Queen. He bent low from his waist and whispered in her ear, Chef sends his apologies, Your Majesty, and says there's no more eggs in the kitchen. What's wrong with the hens? The Queen said. Nothing's wrong with the hens, Your Majesty, Mr. Tibbs whispered. Then tell them to lay more, the Queen said. She looked up at the BFG. Have some toast and marmalade while you're waiting, she said to him. The toast is finished, Mr. Tibbs whispered, and Chef says there's no more bread. Tell him to bake more, the Queen said. With all this going on, Sophie had been telling the Queen everything, absolutely everything about her visit to Giant Country. The Queen listened, appalled. When Sophie had finished, the Queen looked up at the BFG, who was sitting high above her. He was now eating a sponge cake. Big friendly giant, she said. Last night those man-eating brutes came to England. Can you remember where they went the night before? The BFG put a whole round sponge cake into his mouth and chewed it slowly while he thought about what is the question. Yes, Magister, he said. I do think I is remembering where they said they was going the night before last. They was galloping off to Sweden for the Sweden sour taste. Fetch me a telephone, the Queen commanded. Mr. Tibbs placed the instrument on the table. The Queen lifted the receiver. Get me the King of Sweden, she said. Good morning, the Queen said. Is everything all right in Sweden? Everything is terrible, the King of Sweden answered. There is panic in the capital. 2 nights ago, 26 of my loyal subjects disappeared. My whole country is in panic. Your 26 loyal subjects were all eaten by giants, the Queen said. Apparently, they like the taste of Swedes. Why do they like the taste of Swedes? The king asked. Because the Swedes of Sweden have a sweet and sour taste. So says the BFG, the queen said. I don't know what you're talking about, the king said, growing testy. It's hardly a joking matter when one's loyal subjects are being eaten like popcorn. They've eaten mine as well, the queen said. Who's they, for heaven's sake, the king said. Giants, the queen said. Look here, the king said. Are you feeling all right? It's been a rough morning, the queen said. First I had a horrid nightmare. Then my maid dropped my breakfast, and now I've got a giant on my piano. You need a doctor quick, cried the king. I'll be all right, the queen said. I must go now. Thanks for your help. She replaced the receiver. That's the phone. Your BFG is right, the queen said to Sophie. Those 9 man-eating brutes did go to Sweden. It's horrible, Sophie said. Please stop them, your majesty. I'd like to make one more check before I call out the troops, the queen said. Once more she looked up at the BFG. He was eating donuts now, popping them into his mouth, 10 at a time, like peas. Think hard, BFG said. She said, where did those horrid giants say they were going off 3 nights ago? The BFG thought hard and hard. Ho-ho! He cried. Yes, I is remembering. Where? Asked the queen. One was off to Baghdad, the BFG said. As they is galloping past my cave, Flesh Lump Eater is waving his arms and shouting, I is off to Baghdad, and I is going to Baghdad, and Mum and every one of their 10 children as well. Once more the queen lifted the receiver. Get me the Lord Mayor of Baghdad, she said. If they don't have a Lord Mayor, get me the next best thing. In 5 seconds, a voice was on the line. Here is the Sultan of Baghdad speaking, the voice said. Listen, Sultan, the queen said. Did anything unpleasant happen in your city 3 nights ago? Every night unpleasant things are happening here in Baghdad. I want to know if anyone has disappeared recently in Baghdad. Only my uncle, Khalfan Horfan al-Rashid, the Sultan said. He disappeared from his bed 3 nights ago together with his wife and 10 children. There you is, cried the BFG, whose wonderful ears enabled him to hear what the Sultan was saying to the queen on the telephone. Flesh Lump Eater did that one. He went off to Baghdad and Mum and all the little kiddles. The queen replaced the receiver. That proves it, she said, looking up at the BFG. Your story is apparently quite true. Summon the head of the army and the head of the Air Force immediately. So what do you think? Is the queen believing in giants? Is the queen believing her dream? I want you to think about what did the queen do to sort of validate, means to believe what the BFG and Sophie were telling her. So she's calling the head of the Air Force, the military, and the next chapter is called The Plan. So think about this. She's calling the head of her military, and you have to devise a plan. Just like in a story, there's problems. How do you start solving that problem? So keep thinking, keep looking for new vocabulary, and remember that suffix, less, motionless. You could put it speechless. See if you find that in your reading. Happy reading.